So a question I've heard asked many times over the years is, why did AlphaDream die? People ask if Nintendo could have just thrown them some money to save them, or how they could conceivably go bankrupt despite having made so many hit Mario games. It's because of a decade of declining sales, culminating in the 3DS remake of Bowser's Inside Story. This remake was extremely unnecessary in pretty much every possible way. Now, I do think it's technically better in a few ways, but let's be real, what reason was there to buy this? The only new thing it brought to the table was some side mode where you just watch Bowser Jr. fight stuff. Not exactly easy to sell. The original version was already playable on the same hardware and was easy to find for half the price. This is true even now, all these years later. The DS original is plentiful and cheap in the used game market, while the latter is much harder to find. Then the circumstances surrounding its release were immensely stacked against it. The Switch had been out for a year when they announced it, 2 years by the time it was finally released. The Mario & Luigi series had been declining for years too. Dream Team was seen as okay, but not as great as its predecessors. Paper Jam didn't go over well because people were angry about Paper Mario's new direction and saw it as missed potential for a crossover. The Superstar Saga remake, while good and having beautiful environments, unfortunately sterilized a lot of characters. After declining in quality for 3 straight entries, nobody believed this would be good or exciting. But when looking at the bigger picture, it was more like 5 games of poor quality setting the stage and not 3. Paper Mario Sticker Star brought scrutiny to every Mario RPG since it happened. The nuclear backlash to Color Splash just happened right before this was announced, so that scrutiny had grown immensely and was still very raw. Every time a character had an uncreative design, there was hell to pay, and people were quick to say, this is just Sticker Star again. By then, everyone had at least heard in passing that Mario RPGs apparently weren't good anymore. And it doesn't even stop there. People often refer to this as the boring age of Mario. People had little faith in the greater series as a whole since the party games were declining, the sports games were declining, and the platformers, while still good, were often being compared to Galaxy unfavorably. Odyssey was more of an exception at this time and not the rule. Going back to Bowser's Inside Story on 3DS, there wasn't much to actually improve upon because the original version was so good the way it was. When the new version released, people scrutinized the fact that several things were made worse than the original. From the art style, to the game running slower, to worse animations, to Bowser not even saying Showtime that much anymore. I didn't see a lot of complaints about the graphics when it was just Dream Team and Paper Jam, but the Superstar Saga remake caused people to be more critical of the art style now that they could directly compare it to an original game that was a lot more stylized and it aged well. You might call those things nitpicks, but when remaking a game like this after a troubled few years, it's the diehard fans of the original they were trying to win back, and those are the people who would be bothered by these things. Disdain for the new art style was already in full swing before this thing was even announced, and it didn't help that the game had an unstable frame rate when it was easy to find the original version and that didn't stutter. Then Nintendo didn't even treat the remake well. Nintendo had long moved on from the 3DS by now. They were making billions on the Switch, so this little game got basically no marketing. In fact, many of you didn't even know there was a remake when I asked years ago about why people didn't like it. I asked a full year after the game's release date and after AlphaDream's closure was in the news. That was how much this failed to make a splash. Their reason for releasing on the 3DS was to keep the dual screen gameplay intact. In the same interview, they talk about wanting to make future projects. Ouch. Slightly relevant, they skipped over Partners in Time because Bowser's Inside Story was the best received entry in the series, because Fawful's story was set up in Bowser's Minions in the last game that they released, and because they wanted to make the Bowser Jr. side mode. Personally, I think the 3DS and this specific game were chosen because it was cheap to do after the last several entries sold below expectations, and they saw this as the lowest cost thing that could potentially sell. But that's just me. In the end, Bowser's Inside Story on 3DS sold 22,000 copies in its first 3 weeks, making this the lowest selling Mario game since Mario Clash on the Virtual Boy. Remember Concord on PS5? Concord sold better in its first 3 weeks. Concord was a spectacular failure that got loads of attention. This was the kind of failure that no one even noticed or cared about. This game didn't even crack top 50 sales charts after that point, so we don't know how well it did after that. What we do know is no sales figures were reported in Nintendo's earnings after that, and no sales figures were ever reported outside of Japan, period. Meaning it likely never sold 100,000 copies worldwide. This is despite having 5 years to do so before the eShop closed, by the way. If you don't know how outsourcing works in the game industry, usually developers are paid for meeting milestones during development and then get a cut of the sales for the game's first few weeks on store shelves. Even if this was made on a budget, it absolutely lost a lot of money, and this is after sales declined for the last 3 games. It's no wonder AlphaDream died from this. And sadly, it's no wonder Nintendo was done taking chances on them.